questions on a statement made in the House of Commons on Thursday the 15th of December, infected blood update.
My Lords, I would like to begin by thanking the noble lady, the Minister. This statement is welcome, but as I'm sure she would acknowledge, information for victims and their families is long overdue. Earlier this year, the government didn't provide an oral statement to the House when they published Sir Robert's report. Ministers were, of course, forced to publish the report after it had been leaked. And sadly, that has been all too typical of the experience for victims and their families throughout this long and painful process. Most heartbreaking of all is that many of those infected have not lived to see the justice that they deserved. The Terence Higgins Trust calculated that in the 5 years since the start of the inquiry in July 2017, over 400 victims have sadly died. While we await the report conclusion and inquiry, another person dies every 4 days. The Minister knows that answers are needed. So today I have 4 questions to the Minister. The first is, will she commit to the publication of a timetable for the compensation framework? Will she work in partnership with the infected blood community to develop the compensation framework for those affected? When will she end the government's silence on the other 18 recommendations that have so far not been acted on? And fourthly, how will the Minister make sure that everyone who wants to respond to the proposals has the opportunity to do so? Sporadic updates, unfortunately, without any substance, aren't good enough. We would like to see regular progress updates for this House, but more importantly for victims and their families. The contaminated blood scandal has had life-changing impacts on tens of thousands of victims who put their faith in the promise of effective treatment. When the government received a copy of the report by Sir Robert Francis, ministers were clear at that point that it would be published alongside a government response. But the report was published in June and we still haven't had the full government response. It would be helpful to understand why the government's response didn't come with the report. I'm aware that in another place the Minister said that the government is awaiting the full report of the infected blood inquiry chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff before the government responds in full to that report and Sir Robert Francis's report. The Minister at that point said that the issues were so complex that the government couldn't commit to a timetable. But given the inquiry began over 5 years ago, surely the government cannot credibly justify the length of time that this is now taking. Surely the Minister can understand the deep disappointment from victims and their families that this most recent government statement contains nothing to suggest that the government's formal response is forthcoming anytime soon. Victims will not and should not be expected to accept empty gestures. It seems to families that the plan changes with every announcement. In another place, the Minister didn't provide any clarity about the timeline for payments and declined to commit to one. But given the length of time that has elapsed and the broad understanding that now exists about what happened, it's right that affected families must be involved at every stage. The government should have plans to work in partnership with the infected blood community to develop the compensation framework. We acknowledge and warmly welcome the support for victims and their partners in the interim scheme. But we know that the contaminated blood scandal deeply affected other family members and loved ones, such as their parents and their children. So far, their experiences have not been similarly acknowledged. It would be helpful to understand what the government is going to do to ensure that these victims are also supported. There will need to be consultation on the proposed compensation framework, and the government must make sure that everyone who wants to has the opportunity to respond to all of the proposals. So just to repeat my 4 questions to the Minister, because I'm aware that often in these exchanges questions are lost and there can be dozens of them and it can be difficult for ministers. So just for absolute clarity, 1, will she commit to a timetable for the publication of a compensation framework? 2, will she work in partnership with the infected blood community to develop the compensation framework for those affected? 3, when will the government respond to the other 18 recommendations? And 4, how will the government make sure that everyone who wants to respond to the proposed proposals can do so? I apologise for repeating those questions, but there are only 4, and I really would like to leave the chamber with some clarity about the answers. This has been a deeply distressing and shaming episode. We know that what has happened cannot be undone. All that's possible now is to understand, recognise and compensate those harmed so terribly by this scandal. My Lords, as we approach Christmas, the loss of those dearest to us is often felt more keenly than at the rest of the year. And I'm sorry that another Christmas will come and go without the certainty that so many families are owed. I look forward to the Minister's response.
Hear, hear. My Lords, Sir Robert Francis's study into a framework for paying compensation starts with powerful testimony from those who were given infected blood products and those around them who this affected deeply. Members in Another Place shared moving stories of their constituents in responding to this statement last week. And this all points to the absolute urgency of getting compensation to the people who we are morally obligated to help, as ministers now have agreed. We do then need to keep coming back to the timetable for establishing the full scheme and press the government to move as quickly as humanly possible. I'd certainly echo the questions of the noble lady speaking from these benches that we do need a timetable to give people certainty. There has been considerable political turmoil this year, but it's good to know that at least the machinery of government kept working and has now been able to deliver the interim payments that Sir Brian Langstaff asked for in July. It would be helpful for the noble lady, the Minister, to reiterate for the record what I understand the policy to be, that there are no circumstances under which those interim payments, any of those interim payments, could be required to be paid back. They can go up from the £100,000 amount once a final scheme is put in place, but they will never go down. I think that reassurance needs to be repeated for those who are applying to the scheme. Could she also ensure that recipients of compensation are properly protected as they claim for and receive these payments? We know that sadly there are some less moral people out there who will seek to take advantage of those entitled to compensation in any such scheme, either through excessive charges to support them through the claim process or by defrauding them or seeking to defraud them once they've received the funds. Could the Minister explain what steps the government is taking to ensure that we do minimise the risks of financial exploitation of claimants both during and after the claim process? Finally, Sir Robert's report included a recommendation for an arm's-length body to be set up to manage the compensation scheme. And this seems sensible as a way to build confidence from all parties concerned and shows lessons being learnt from previous schemes such as the Windrush scheme, where certainly there was a breakdown in confidence and that damaged the scheme. Is the government looking at how such a body could be set up so that it does and ensure that they're doing that now under the committee that I understand is being led by Sue Gray in the Cabinet Office, to ensure that setting up such a body does not itself become a source of further delay if this is what the inquiry eventually recommends?
My Lords, perhaps I could just start by saying that this is an unimaginably awful matter, causing heartbreak and pain to all those directly and indirectly affected. It's a deeply shaming episode, as the noble lady opposite rightly said. And of course it dates back so many years to the 70s and 80s. It's a tragedy that has affected actually all governments. And you know, we have to resolve it and move forward. And also, the thing she didn't mention was the need to ease the stigma and to be more vocal, I think, about the awful experiences of those involved and their loved ones, especially, you know, a long time ago when AIDS and HIV and so on were less well understood. And if I could just respond quickly to Lord Allen, who asked about the interim payments, which I think we've all welcomed. And it was, I think, been an amazing effort by the machine, once those were recommended, to actually make all of them by the end of October. And they can only go up, they can't come down, which I think was the reassurance he was seeking. Moving on, the noble lady had a number of questions. I think the first question was, can we commit to publish a full timetable for compensation? Clearly, that is something that we would like to do, but the truth is, as she will understand from the statement made in the other place, it was the intention of the government to publish its response to the compensation framework alongside the study, and timing and so on, but the sheer complexity and interdependencies have meant that we are not able to set a timetable or to answer one of her other points, to respond on all the other recommendations in Sir Francis's extremely good and perceptive report on compensation, because of the interdependencies, until we have the report from Sir Brian. Now, I understand that is expected next summer. I can't say anything more explicit, and clearly we will need to respond. But the plans we've put in place will ensure that we are ready to respond. So the group led by Sue Gray was referenced, and that is progressing work on many fronts. This is a priority for government. So she's bringing together permanent secretaries from, obviously, there's a prime group of the Treasury and HMRC, the Cabinet Office leading that, and DHSC, but it's also involving DWP, DLUC, the devolved nations, and others as necessary, so that the preparations are being made, so that once the complexities are resolved with Sir Brian's report, we're able to move very quickly. Clearly the government want to work with the people affected. We've already, I should take the opportunity to say how amazing the APPG has been. So Dame Diana and Sir Peter Bottomley, and indeed in this house I know Baroness Finlay and Baronesses Meacher have been involved. And of course, both Sir Brian and Sir Robert have also consulted. And as we get closer to paying out more compensation, there will obviously be more work with the various groups. I'm glad to see the noble Lord Allen nodding, because I think the schemes have got to be sort of collaborative, actually, to pick up some of the wordings of the report by Sir Robert. They've got to be collaborative and sympathetic and as free of stress as possible for these people who've had sort of unending disappointments, but also simple and easy to access. And they've got to be consistent with our fight against fraud and scammers. So I'm very glad that Lord Allen made that point. That is, again, high on our agenda. We are working cross-government to make sure we can deliver on the recommendations of the report. As I have already explained, it's a high-level cross-government working group. It's meeting monthly. It's gearing up, thinking about the IT systems, how we make sure we contact people who might want to seek compensation once we know the precise framework. And making sure everyone can respond. I think with these public issues, that I think publicity is very, very important. And people across the House can help with that, so that people do know what is happening. The final point I don't think I've covered is about whether there should be an ALB. That's one of the recommendations in the Sir Robert report. And we are, of course, giving that very careful consideration. It's clear how important it is that any vehicle for delivery of a compensation scheme carries the trust of the victims. I really can't make that point strongly enough. But it's also got to achieve the objective of delivering compensation in a speedy and efficient manner. And of course, there are issues about legislation and so on, which the Grey Group are looking at. So, to conclude, we are doing everything that we can within the constraints that I've described, and which the Paymaster General, who spoke in the House last week, was very honest about. We will be making progress statements to the House so that we don't repeat the difficulties of the past, and we're absolutely determined as a government to give this priority and get this thing sorted, because it has been a serious failure, and we have to compensate those who've had such a ghastly time.
My Lords, can I declare an interest as a health minister 43 years ago and someone who's been told they may be a potential witness in this inquiry? And along with others who've served in another place, we have all met those who have suffered from these tragic errors and have waited so long. We want to see early resolution. Can I urge my noble friend to give sympathetic consideration to the point raised by Lord Allen, following up the recommendation of Sir Robert Francis, that there should be an arm's-length body to administer compensation with independence of judgment and accountability to Parliament. That seems to be a crucial factor in maintaining confidence in the system. And finally, could I ask my noble friend whether there are some lessons to be learnt by government from this tragedy? The fatal errors were made in the 1980s. The inquiry was established in 2017. It's going to be 2023 before we get the final recommendations, and then there will be payments. Are there some lessons to be learned about the sheer timescale of the inquiry in order to minimise the distress that's going to be caused in the future?
I thank my noble friend. I think I've said probably about as much as I can say about having an arm's length body, but clearly it's helpful to have his advice on this important matter, and no options are ruled out, and that is certainly one of the recommendations which we're looking at very, very seriously. But independence of making sure everybody gets the compensation they need and trust in the system are, I think, a lesson that needs to be learned. I like his challenge always that we need to learn lessons from mistakes that are made in government. Coming from another world, it's something that I always try to do. And clearly, I think across all parties, we have been slow to take a grip of this awful issue. Having said that, the Conservative government in 2017 did set up the inquiry into inflected blood, and then we commissioned Sir Robert Francis to do a compensation study, and of course the force of that study led Sir Brian, they're both involved in this and they worked together, to recommend on 29th of July 2022 that an interim payment should be made. And by October we've paid that interim payment to all those he recommended to receive it, and we've ensured that it's also exempt from tax and disregarded for benefits.
My Lord, as the noble lady, the Minister, said, this is a tragedy, and it's almost unimaginable what the families that were affected by this have gone through and are going through. My question actually is very simple, and it follows on two noble lords that have spoken. Does the government anticipate that all people who've suffered infection will get an interim payment, or is it limited?
The interim payment is confined to those who Sir Robert suggested it should be paid to. So that was those who were infected, and of course there was a scheme ongoing over a number of years to make payments to those affected. So we had, I think, about 4,000 of them. So we knew who those were, and their bereaved partners. And it was limited, if you look at Sir Francis' report, because he felt the complexities of deciding who else should receive compensation were too difficult, and that we should therefore come back to the wider group when we had Sir Brian's report.
The whole House is grateful to the noble lady, the Minister, for accepting that there have been too many long delays over the years with this. On the third page of the statement, there's a reference to possible delays with working with the devolved administrations. And I would just very gently point out that we've had 2 bills going through your Lordship's House this year where work was done speedily with devolved administrations, one of which she knows very well is the procurement bill, but there was also the health and care bill, where in fact members of your Lordship's House were not allowed to lay amendments because pre-agreement had been made with devolved administrations. So it's certainly possible to work at pace. So can I ask her, if the spirit of the government is willing to move this forward, will they please prioritise these sorts of discussions, including with the devolved administrations, to overcome the hurdles? And then just finally, my lords, I used to work with a theatre group that performed at Lord Mayor Treloar School every summer. And of the 89 haemophiliac children who were at Lord Mayor Treloar in the 70s and 80s, only a quarter are still alive, and of course some of them are dying. And they're psychologically scarred, not least because they were children away from home and had no say in the treatment that they were given, which everyone believed was a miracle cure. And factor 8 was going to be the change of life for haemophiliacs. Instead, for many of them, it's become death. And I just really want to finally echo the questions raised by many other noble lords. It would be really helpful for the government to say a date by which it will confirm that it will come back with clear proposals. The problem with this statement, generous though it is that it just pushes things further into the long grass. My lords, to paraphrase another well-known saying, compensation delayed is compensation denied. And in this case, it's also about justice being delayed and justice being denied.
Thank the noble lady for those comments, which underline the scale and gravity and the dreadful consequences of this. It's very important that we dwell on that point. I think it's important to those who've been affected that they understand our sympathy as well. In terms of her question, we obviously hope and expect to get the report, next summer, and that in turn we will then move absolutely as fast as we can. I think it's clear that those of us who are now working in the Cabinet Office are giving this a very high degree of commitment. And I can assure her in relation to the devolved administration that we're also trying to work closely with devolved administrations. She knows that because we work together on the procurement bill, so she knows that I mean it. It will be a UK-wide scheme, which I think is a good thing, but she will know that there were disparities in the support scheme payments made, and we actually took action, I think it's probably the DHSC, took action to remedy that in a parity exercise, so that the Northern Irish, who was slightly behind, we made sure that the things were aligned. So that is an example of how we've been working with devolved administrations. And when I answered the noble lady opposite's question at the beginning, I did make it clear that the devolved administrations were part of efforts to anticipate the findings that will come through and make sure that we're well prepared.